organization, Osteo Boston. I want to say thank you for getting on live. And we really are benefiting greatly by your questions after our speaker finishes. And so if you could put them in the chat when you're done, that would be fabulous. And I also want to speak to our YouTube audience and say thank you for getting on. And if you like this video, give us a thumbs up, and it will help us to determine future content by knowing that you liked it. And if you want to subscribe, you'll be able to get the latest videos in your own inbox. So with all that said, I want to say how excited I am today. And let me go ahead and say how much I'm excited to have Adam Stark here. And Adam is our speaker tonight, and he is going to now talk to us. So thank you, Adam. Welcome.
Thank you, Shelley. And thank you for inviting me into your living rooms. I've been on Zoom a whole bunch of times, whether I'm speaking or just attending something. And I don't really know what an osteoporosis support group is, but, just everyone getting introduced to everyone, the one woman who logged on for a moment just to say hi and then left, it really does feel like I'm in people's living rooms, and I'm sort of honored and pleased to be there. And in case anyone failed to read between the lines of what Shelley said when she introduced me, anything I do wrong tonight, it's Leslie Fisher's fault. She invited me. So hi, Leslie. So I've talked about a lot of topics in natural medicine over the years, and for some reason the osteoporosis talk is the most popular, the one that I keep on doing and people keep on wanting to attend. And there have been a lot of incarnations of this talk. Sometimes I just feel like I want to list, let's talk about this, let's talk about this, let's talk about this. But at some point, I really felt the need to have an overarching theme to organize all the things that I want to talk about. And so let me start with the theme. The theme is, it's not all about calcium. And it's funny because I make that more and more explicit the more I talk, and yet people will still say that was a wonderful talk you gave about calcium. Calcium is just so ingrained in our consciousness. So I'm going to talk a little bit about calcium. And then I'm going to talk about a few other things as well. I'm also accustomed to talking for 90 minutes, so I'm going to try to skip right past the osteoclast and the osteoblast and sort of jump right into some of the nutrients. And the one thing I always do say as an introduction, please do raise your hand. Please just do unmute yourself and speak up if I say anything that is unclear. If it's unclear to you, it's unclear to the person in the square next to you, and you'll be doing everyone a favor. So let's talk calcium. Why is calcium the thing that we keep on focusing on? Well, it makes sense. We think of bones as calcium. The dairy industry for a long time, is sort of what it hung its hat on. I mean, when you think about it, back when we had 4 food groups, broccoli and raspberries had to share the same food group. Hamburgers and peanuts had to share the same food group. Dairy had a food group all on its own. And that was largely on the basis of calcium sort of being up on this pedestal. It was such a self-evident thing that calcium was the solution to our bones that a lot of us have overlooked and continue to overlook some of the research on calcium, which really paints a different picture. I'm not going to cite study after study after study, and it's hard to do because not all the studies agree with each other. But I will say, having read a lot of them, the picture that I take away from it is that calcium supplementation in most people is of marginal benefit. There are some studies where it has some benefit, usually not much. A few very rare studies where there's significant benefit, a lot of studies where it does very little. I know since you all have been attending the support group for a while, you've probably encountered the idea that calcium can actually be counterproductive. There was a meta-analysis published about 10 years ago that really seemed to show that. And if I can go back a step, for those who don't know or unfamiliar with the term, a meta-analysis is when you take a whole bunch of different pieces of research and add them up statistically to get a big picture. So let's say you have one study that says this, one study that says that, they disagree with each other, or they have slightly different conclusions. There are certain statistical methods to, again, add them up and get a big picture. We do that for a few reasons. One is to resolve conflicting data sets. One is because sometimes certain results are rare enough that we're not sure if they're random chance. So for example, you have one study with 100 people in a treatment group, 100 people in a placebo group. 2 people in the treatment group have a result, 3 people in the placebo group have a result. That's 50% more. 3 is 50% more than 2, but it's also only 1 more person. Could be random chance. So you take 10 of these studies or 20 of these studies, add them up. Now, instead of, like 3 and 2, it's 30 and 20 or 300 and 200. All of a sudden, these things are statistically significant. So that's what a meta-analysis does. And a meta-analysis was done looking at 11 trials on calcium supplementation, generally people at risk of some sort of osteoporosis or diagnosed with osteoporosis. And what it found is that while there was a very slight reduction in fracture risk, there was also a slight increase in serious heart disease, stroke and heart attack in particular. And assuming that there actually was a greater increase in heart attack and stroke in people taking calcium than there was a decrease in fracture. So assuming we're going to say that a heart attack or a stroke, fatal or not, is equal, right, in air quotes, to a fracture, this meta-analysis showed us that calcium supplementation does more harm than good. Now, oh my goodness, are we all poisoning ourselves? Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. It always is. We can ask ourselves, first of all, do the benefits from calcium take longer to manifest than the harms? And I think that's a really valid question. But, it also raises the question, is calcium itself inherently a problem, or is it a problem only in certain contexts? So now you take a look at the Nurses' Health Study. Nurses' Health Study is the largest longitudinal study on health and nutrition in the history of the Western world. There's one study out of China that can sort of rival it. It has tracked tens of thousands of people for decades. Going back to what a meta-analysis is, and I'm sorry to jump all over the place, but going back to what a meta-analysis is, when you add up these studies to get a big picture, you have certain rules about which studies get added. So, you're not going to have one study that's calcium and magnesium, one that's calcium and vitamin D, one that's calcium and Fosamax, one that's calcium and Actonel, one that's calcium and exercise. You try to make sure all the studies are basically the same so you don't have a polluted or confusing data set. So the meta-analysis was looking at just calcium supplementation. Now we look at the Nurses' Health Study, looking at data on calcium plus vitamin D. There was no significant heart disease risk when vitamin D was added. So that starts to paint a slightly different picture. So, if the one overarching concept, overarching concept 1A is it's not just about calcium. Overarching concept 1B, and we're starting to see this now, is that it's not just about calcium, it's about calcium management. So we look at the harms associated with calcium supplementation. And again, forgive me if I'm just breezing past my normal pace, but it is becoming more and more evident they have to do with not that calcium itself is inherently a problem or dangerous. It's that calcium alone doesn't provide the tools the body needs to manage it correctly. Not only is it not going to the wrong places, but it's potentially going to the wrong places. You throw in a little bit of vitamin D, you're supporting calcium management. We don't see those problems. And there are a few other studies that tend to support that, although again, these results are small enough that you need large studies to really show that. So we're going to be talking about calcium. We're going to be talking about calcium management. So we're going to be talking about vitamin D, which is involved in calcium management. We're going to be talking about magnesium. We're going to be talking about vitamin K and vitamin K2 in particular, and we're going to be talking about strontium. I'm going to breeze past all the weight-bearing exercise. You all already know that. If you don't, weight-bearing exercise is good. And to be clear, that is not weightlifting exercise, that is weight-bearing exercise. Bicep curls put a lot of weight on the muscle. They don't put a lot of weight on the spine or on the major joints. What does is walking, jumping rope, climbing stairs, just being up and about in life. There's certain kinds of yoga that'll also really engage those sorts of things. Swimming, not so much, because again, you're not putting weight on the bones. At any rate, so back to calcium. So, I don't mean to be painting a picture of calcium as, again, inherently problematic, or that it's not needed at all. How much calcium do we need? So here's where I don't want to outsource. Here's where I am going to outsource my opinion to another expert. I hate doing that, because as soon as you start outsourcing your opinion to experts, you can find an expert to agree with anything. Having said that, I'm a big fan of a man called Walter Willett. He was the head of the Harvard School of Public Health. The Department of Nutrition in the Harvard School of Public Health. He also was the head of the Nurses' Health Study. And he is, if there's a who's who of nutrition epidemiologists, nutritional experts in this country, if not the world, he probably is at the top of the pyramid. So Walter Willett says that 500 to 700 milligrams of calcium a day is enough. Now, if you're like me, you used to hear 1,000, 1,200, 1,500. Where do those numbers come from? Again, they come from, in a sense, public health momentum. Those numbers come from the fact that they're the numbers we've always had. They may not actually come from any concrete science. Walter Willett says 500 to 700. I like saying 600 to 1,000 just because it's so hard for me to shake what I was originally taught. But what I will say is that if you drink a glass of milk a day, or some fortified orange juice or fortified soy milk or whatever you do, that's 300 right there, 300 to 400. You're going to pick up an extra few hundred through random food. That does suggest that most people do not need supplementation. Having said that, if you are looking for a calcium supplement, often we are taught to talk about calcium carbonate versus calcium citrate as the competing forms of calcium. And we're taught to say that calcium carbonate is poor absorbing, relies on stomach acid. Stomach acid depletes as we get older. It's harder for us to digest and absorb. And we're taught to say that calcium citrate is better absorbing, needs less stomach acid, digests and absorbs more easily. And that's true. But the hurdle for most of us is not getting calcium absorbed in terms of getting into our bloodstream. It's not getting from the gut into the bloodstream that's the major hurdle for us. It's getting from the bloodstream into the bone. And neither calcium citrate nor calcium carbonate has an especial advantage that way. Where do we get that advantage? There are forms of calcium derived from food or food-like substances. There is a form called microcrystalline hydroxyapatite, MCHA. It's my favorite supplement form. If you're vegetarian, you should know it comes from cow bones. It is the least vegetarian thing you can find in the health food store. And I will say the research on it isn't really strong. There isn't really strong research on any of the advanced forms of calcium. They just haven't been studied much, but the little bit we have seen is very heartening for me. It does seem to suggest some better bone health benefits versus just absorption into the bloodstream benefits we see with carbonate and citrate. There are also forms derived from algae. Again, the research isn't very strong. My interpretation of the research is that it rivals the MCHA. It just costs twice as much. And there are potentially issues with heavy metal contamination, although the good companies really should watch that. There have been some scandals where companies have not. So again, I like MCHA. And if I didn't make this clear already, I do want to make it clear now. When we talk about 500 to 700 milligrams or 1,000 milligrams, or even if we're talking 12 to 1,500, that is the total daily intake we're shooting for. So if you're getting that glass of milk and some random food, subtract 500 from your goal. You only need to make up the difference with pills. Other food sources of calcium, dairy is wonderful. I'm accustomed to people in health food stores. I don't hear it that much anymore, but I used to hear, dairy is bad for you. It's mucus forming. We're the only animal that consumes milk, not of their own mothers, and just, well, cats do it too. They don't have opposable thumbs to get it. So I don't want to say milk is bad for anyone. It's a great source of calcium. Actually, the one area I've seen milk being bad, I've seen some solid research, is in acne. But otherwise, a generally healthful food. We all know the fortified foods. Greens are overrated as a source of calcium. They have a lot of calcium per calorie, but you have to eat a big plate to get a substantial amount. There's some other things about greens that make them good. Don't get me wrong, the way they alkalize the system, and there's some interesting data taking alkalizing pills and how that affects bone density. But again, for just the sheer numbers, like the milligrams and grams of calcium, they don't provide it. Some fish do, especially fish with small bones. A really good mineral water will. And you should look at the content on your mineral water. One of the things that I absolutely believe, and I cannot cite any good science on, is one of the best things we can do for our general health is consume mineral-rich water. It is one of those things that seems to be common in some of the blue zones, the sort of the high longevity zones of the world. Just take my belief for what it is. And then we can talk about bone broth. And of all the things I've ever said that I wish I hadn't said, I used to say that bone broth was really rich in calcium because someone said it to me and I just repeated it. If you look at the label of a bone broth you buy in a store, there's almost no calcium in it. Bones have calcium. Bone broth does not have calcium unless you make it yourself the old-fashioned way with a lot of vinegar in the pot. The acidity is going to pull some of the calcium out of the bones. It's also going to taste like you're drinking chicken broth lemonade. You're not going to like it necessarily. But, again, store-bought bone broth, if it doesn't taste very sour, don't count on it having a lot of calcium. So calcium, get enough. Don't try to get more than you need. That's my take-home message on calcium. Now, someone emailed me, I believe it was Leslie, asking me to address the calcium to magnesium ratio. That is a great question. So let's talk about magnesium sort of generally, first of all. Let's talk about ratios after that. Now, I've tried doing this talk a few different ways over the years. As I've said, I used to try to list everything possible you might care about. At some point, I started trying to do a top 5. Here are the top 5 things you need to care about. And I never knew where I wanted to put magnesium. Should it be on the top 5 or not? And what I finally decided is if I'm giving this talk in a McDonald's, it is absolutely in the top 5 because we do want magnesium. The question is just, do we get it in our diet? And where do we not get it in our diet? At McDonald's. So where do we get magnesium? We get it in whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds. Everything that falls out of what we tend to call the modern westernized diet. It's not really a westernized diet, it's an industrialized diet. A modern diet in Japan or in France or in Africa is going to have some of the same problems. We start refining our grains, taking the beans out of the diet, taking the nuts and seeds out of the diet, taking the fresh things out of the diet. We're left with very little magnesium. And then if we're like an American, I'm an American. I also love cheese and dairy. But if we're eating a standard American diet, that is just calcium, 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 dairy, 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 and we're not getting these other sources of magnesium, we start to really see a high calcium to magnesium ratio in a diet, which we want to correct with supplements. And that is where I want to put magnesium in my top 5. If you shop at health food stores all day long, and that is what you eat, and you eat the stuff that people like me tell you you should eat, do as I say, not as I do, then you probably don't need to take magnesium pills. What does magnesium do in terms of the bones? Well, magnesium helps calcium be absorbed into the protein matrix of the bones. Now, if I'm doing this talk in person, and if I have my props, I tend to start the talk by holding up, let's pretend I'm just sitting at my wife's work desk, so I don't really have my props, but let's pretend this is a hot dog, and let's pretend this is a piece of chalk. So when I'm doing the talk, I hold up the hot dog and I hold up the piece of chalk and I say, look at this hot dog. This is just protein. Look how floppy it is, right? This would not be an effective bone. This would not be an effective lever on which the muscles could pull to move the body. You need something with rigidity. Look at this piece of chalk. It's calcium. Look how rigid it is, right? Look how great it works. And then if I'm doing this talk in person, I take the piece of chalk and I drop it, and it shatters on the floor. And then I make my point with all my visual aids that calcium provides rigidity, protein provides resilience, and you need both, right? So there's a protein matrix in the bones, which provides the resiliency. It's why how your bones sort of don't break when you fall. And there's the calcium, the mineral in there, which is what's going to provide the rigidity so your bones don't flop around and be useless, right? So we need our calcium to be absorbed or incorporated into the protein matrix of the bones. Magnesium helps that happen. Now, what does that mean in the real world? Sometimes I'm mystified by how research changes. If I was going to cite the research that I saw published 15 years ago, I would point to a few studies that really look compelling, where magnesium was a good proportion of the time, not just arresting or slowing bone loss in postmenopausal women, but actually reversing it. For some reason, the research that's come out in the last 10 years is not quite as positive. Not quite sure what to make of that, because it seems like it's similar methodology, similar study groups. I just don't know. Still, there tends to be a general positive, even though there's less of that reversing of bone loss. There does seem to be some of it, and a good amount of it not going downhill as fast. Calcium to magnesium ratios are important. And this is where I think it was Leslie's question via email came up, which is, what is the ratio we want to shoot for? I shouldn't say everyone. A lot of people say, and I was taught to say, we want a 2-to-1 ratio of calcium to magnesium. Maybe. It's another one of those things we've said forever, and no one's actually proven. Some people have apparently traced that back to a French scientist or a French doctor who at one point said, we want at least 1 part magnesium to 2 parts calcium. And for some reason, they were taken as gospel, and then the translation lost the phrase "at least." So I don't know the truth of this. I'm not enough of a medical historian to trace why we believe what we believe today. But what I will say is this: even if we are looking for a 2-to-1 ratio, calcium to magnesium, let's say 1,000 milligrams calcium, 500 magnesium. And I frankly think we could use more magnesium. But even if we're looking at 2 parts calcium to 1 part magnesium, that doesn't mean you want to buy a pill that is 2 parts calcium to 1 part magnesium. If your diet is completely balanced, then yes, get 2-to-1, maintain that balance. But if your diet is already imbalanced, you want a pill that is going to be skewed the other direction to correct that imbalance. Again, if you are eating refined carbohydrates and a lot of cheese, you might want to skip the calcium entirely and take just magnesium. Now, one of my little litmus tests for when we're getting enough magnesium or when we could use more magnesium is actually something that I'm coming to learn is a remarkably common thing people deal with, and that is nighttime leg cramps. If you have nighttime leg cramps, that is often a good indication. Well, first of all, make sure you're not dehydrated. Make sure you're not consuming vast amounts of sodium and not enough potassium. Make sure you haven't just done leg day at the gym. But if you find that nighttime leg cramps are something that comes up, even 2 or 3 times a month, where it wakes you up and it's hard to sort of, get that Charlie horse out, that almost always indicates that you're getting a lot of calcium and less magnesium than you want. And taking magnesium, even 400 to 600 milligrams all by itself in the evening will help resolve that and hopefully move your bone health in a positive direction. I tend to believe that a 1-to-1 ratio of calcium to magnesium is what we should be shooting for. Maybe a 3 to 2 ratio of calcium to magnesium, but I don't honestly know. I don't think anyone honestly knows. And I think a lot of the people who opine on the subject don't know that they don't actually know. So let me just leave it at that. Except for to add the magnesium has enough health benefits that if you're on the fence about should you take more, it may be worth taking more.
Can I
Some of
just
the
ask you a question about that?
yes.
So if you're not waking up at night with the cramps, but you are having cramps during the day or later in the evening or whatever, does that mean that you have too much calcium instead of magnesium?
So thank you for asking that question, and it gives me an opportunity to clarify something I don't think I made clear. When I talk about this as a litmus test, I mean to say it's not a fail-safe litmus test. To me, it's an indication that it's something that I ought to be concerned about, but not necessarily like it is proving this is a fact, nighttime or daytime. And I didn't mean to indicate nighttime specifically. It's just when most people complain about it happening. What I would say is if you increase your magnesium supplementation and you find the leg cramps resolve, to me that indicates you're not just fixing leg cramps, you're fixing a magnesium deficiency, which ought to have some ramifications elsewhere in the body. People often find when they take and I'm sorry, did that answer or sort of answer your question?
Yeah, it did, and I'm pretty good at taking like 1,000 milligrams of calcium and 500 magnesium. So you're suggesting to take more magnesium?
Yes.
Okay, thank
See
you.
what happens. Give it a week to 2 weeks and see if the leg cramps don't get better. There are different forms of magnesium out there. Magnesium oxide is the cheap bad form. I put bad in air quotes again. What makes it bad is that it doesn't absorb well. Magnesium that doesn't absorb well stays in the gut and can draw more water into the gut. It can give you loose stools. So one of the reasons why I put bad in air quotes is if you are taking magnesium because you have some form of constipation or not lacking regularity, the cheap bad form of magnesium is going to get you there faster than others, better than others. I'd say the ideal form of magnesium for absorption and for not affecting your bowel habits one way or the other is a form called magnesium glycinate. Magnesium citrate is kind of in the middle, and there are a lot of other forms out there. They all have a lot of syllables, but magnesium glycinate is well distributed. I think a lot of stores and companies sell it, and it's sort of my magnesium of choice. I just noticed the time, so I'm going to breeze through a lot of things really, really quickly. I am sorry, I'm not good at being brief. So let's talk vitamin D. Vitamin D is technically speaking not a vitamin. Vitamins, by strict definitions, have to be something that is necessary to take through the diet. The body cannot make it itself. We can make vitamin D ourselves. Technically, vitamin D is an anabolic steroid because a steroid just has well, let's not go there. We're running out of time. Let's just call it a vitamin for now. So it is something we make when sun hits our skin. And it's funny, if I'd given this talk 20 years ago, I would have said vitamin D, I would have breezed past it in a sentence. If I was given this talk 10 years ago, I would have put vitamin D up on a pedestal. Vitamin D is the greatest thing ever. Again, the research, it's embarrassing how much certainty I have had in the past about things. And I think a lot of people who've spoken on these subjects, whether it's from the natural or the orthodox side, the newest round of research on vitamin D tends to suggest that while vitamin D is useful for bone health, people in the highest 20% of intake, it may actually be counterproductive. People in the top 20%, people in the second highest 20%, they're doing great. So what does vitamin D do? Vitamin D helps bring calcium into the blood from the gut. It helps it get from the blood into the bones. It's better at getting it into the blood than it is getting it into the bones, though. So as to why the top 20% is having these counterintuitive results, I don't know. I still recommend high doses of vitamin D for immune function. And I this is going to sound alarmist or overstated, so forgive me. But what I'd say is this: if you're more afraid of a fracture than of COVID, take a moderate dose of vitamin D. If you're more afraid of COVID than a fracture, take a high dose of vitamin D. I think that, you know, what we can expect to see in terms of immune health, whether it's tamping down an excessive immune response or bolstering a immune response that maybe isn't as effective as we'd hope, it really does live up to the promise. For bone health, let me just say, if you get out in the sun and get enough color on your arms and legs to get just enough sun on your arms and legs to get a little bit of color, you're probably fine, probably. And in wintertime, most of us can use a supplement, something in the range of 2000 IU. You know, I'd also say, you know, get a blood test to see how you do seasonally. But the other dirty little secret is no one quite knows what the ideal blood test numbers should be. We're all kind of guessing at these things. We know what too low is, we know what too high is, but there's a huge range in the middle, and we're still not quite sure where ideal lands there. Strontium. So strontium puts up the best numbers I have ever seen in research on osteoporosis in natural medicine, period, hands down. Nothing even comes close. So why is there the controversy? Well, there are 4 things about strontium that make it controversial. First of all, show of hands, who hears strontium and thinks that it is radioactive? Okay, so it isn't. That's number 5. We're going to blow past that. There are 4 things that made strontium controversial, and to a certain degree make strontium controversial even today. The first thing is some of the initial studies showed increases in bone density that were so dramatic in a short period of time that people were worried that it was promoting bone growth in a way that would be unhealthy or unsustainable. You know, if we show like a 1.3% increase at 18 months, what are we going to show in 18 years? Is there going to be, are we going to see bone spurs? Are we going to see these gnarly protuberances? I mean, we don't know, right? Well, now we know. We've tracked people for a decade or more. It doesn't tend to happen. It doesn't tend to happen. It doesn't happen. Source of controversy number 2. Does it even help? So bone density is not, we do and we don't care about bone density. The fact of the matter is bone density is like blood pressure. It is a marker for something that could happen to you that is really bad, but you could live your entire life with sky-high blood pressure and bone density like Swiss cheese. But if you never have a heart attack and you never have a fracture, it doesn't matter, right? It's just a marker for risk. So bone density is a measure of how much mineral there is in bone. Not how much protein matrix, not how healthy the protein matrix is, not how resilient the bones are, just how much mineral is in there. And strontium gets absorbed into the bones. So we heard a lot of people saying that we're seeing these incredible improvements in bone density, but maybe they just are that strontium is triggering the machine, triggering the scan in a way that does not correlate in any way, shape, or form with fracture risk. As far as I'm concerned, that was a very, very valid concern. But again, now we have the research that has tracked people longer term, and we have seen meaningful, significant fracture risk reduction with strontium. I should also mention, by the way, if anyone remembers the periodic table, strontium is in the same column as calcium. The body is funny in some ways where it tends to confuse or conflate things in the same column. Iodine, fluorine, and chlorine. You know, you take in a ton of chlorine, the body, I mean, it's a long story, but strontium does trigger some of the same processes that calcium does and does so more strongly. So even when it is not being incorporated into the bone, it may trigger some bone formation processes. Any rate, so, you know, source of controversy number 1, will it promote bone growth that is too much? No. Will it not actually reduce fracture risk? Again, no. Source of controversy number 3, most, if not all of the research has been on a form of strontium called strontium ranelate. Due to trade copyright issues, that is not for sale right now. So you're buying strontium citrate supplements. Will strontium citrate work like strontium ranelate does? I've never seen any research. I see no reason to believe it wouldn't. I've known a lot of people who have had significant increases in bone density taking the supplement. So just, if my experience is worth anything, I'm not concerned about that at all. Source of controversy number 4, can strontium kill you? And the answer is maybe. I'm sorry, this may be a little bit melodramatic, but there was a meta-analysis out of England, sponsored by their version of the FDA. Strontium is an approved osteoporosis treatment in the UK, in England. So they take the research fit a little bit more seriously. And what they were able to show is that people who took strontium, who had uncontrolled risk factors for heart disease, that's high blood pressure or high cholesterol that were not controlled by medication or some other way, had a 0.6% increased risk of having a non-fatal heart attack. You know, that's a 1 in 150 chance. There was no increased risk that was statistically discernible among people who didn't already have these risk factors. And there was no increased risk of a fatal heart attack in any group. So it's like, okay, what are you going to do with that? You know, personally, anytime that I use the word heart attack in a sentence, I feel compelled to take a real pause and take a deep breath and say, can I try anything else first? I don't care if I don't have uncontrolled high blood pressure or uncontrolled high cholesterol. I don't care if the risk of heart attack is only non-fatal. This is how I manage and interact with risk. Now, if I were in a situation where I tried everything else and it wasn't working, and I saw my bone density going downhill, and I felt like I was at real risk of a fracture, I would take strontium really seriously. I probably would take strontium. But let me just say, it is something that my tolerance for risk, especially when I'm advising other people to do things, is low. I have a lot of tolerance for risk if I might give someone a rash or a diarrhea or a headache, but I don't want to give someone a heart attack. So controversy, point of controversy number 4 with strontium, I would take it seriously. And we still sell strontium at the health food store, and still people do really well with it. Years ago, there was a product, I mean, there's still a product now called the Grow Bone system, which was algae, calcium, vitamin D, magnesium, and strontium. Under the company's old ownership, they used to do a double money back guarantee. You take it for 6 months. If you don't see an increase in bone density, they'll refund everything you paid for 6 months on the product, plus reimburse you for your DEXA scan. We saw a lot of people seeing improvements in bone density. So again, this is a great supplement. It just asterisks, right? So let me talk about my last favorite, my favorite supplement, and that's vitamin K2. Give me a brief moment to sip something.
Take your time.
Okay, I'll spend 9 sipping and 1 talking. Vitamin K2. So if you were like me, you were taught that vitamin K is for clotting. K is for coagulation. At least it was in the original German, when that's how they spell it, with a K. Yes, vitamin K is for clotting. It's involved in the clotting cascade. But there are different forms of vitamin K, and all of them have some relation to calcium management. In particular, the forms of what's called vitamin K2, which are wonderful here. To further complicate things, there's not just a K1 and a K2, there are different subtypes of K2. And the 2 primary ones there are called MK4 and MK7. So let's talk about MK4 and MK7. I'm sorry to make this more complicated than it needs to be, or maybe this is exactly as complicated as it needs to be. MK4 is a form of vitamin K2, which has been researched in Japan since the 1990s. It is an approved osteoporosis drug in Japan for decades. They've done a lot of research there. There have been around 24 human clinical trials, good human clinical trials, many of which have had meaningful endpoints like fracture risk reduction. They've used it in a lot of different study populations. It works again and again and again. Now, works means different things to different studies, but it's hard to find a study where it doesn't work. You know, one of my favorite studies, and this goes back, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, it wasn't just a placebo-controlled trial, it was a 3-arm trial. So it was the vitamin MK4, placebo, and then I believe Fosamax as an active control. So this was interesting. Both the Fosamax and the vitamin K2 outperformed the placebo. The Fosamax actually worked better than the vitamin K2 in this trial in terms of bone density numbers. There was a slight advantage there. The vitamin K2 worked better than the Fosamax for fracture risk reduction. So if this was the longer version of this talk, and I was talking about osteoclasts and osteoblasts, the cells that build up bone and break down bone, I would have, and I'm assuming most of you know this stuff already. So let's just say that vitamin K2 doesn't just inhibit osteoclastic activity. It doesn't just prevent the breaking down of bone. It actually stimulates both the breakdown and the buildup of bone. So you're actually refreshing and renewing bone versus just keeping the bone you've got. And what that means is that even though Fosamax puts us some better numbers on bone density, in meaningful, measurable ways, like are you actually going to break a bone when you fall, the vitamin K2, at least in this one study, seemed to promote bone quality more. Because again, you're breaking down the old brittle bone, you're increasing the new resilient bone. Not all studies are this good, but again, it's hard to find a study of the MK4 where it doesn't work. One study was like with quadriplegics. They've tested it in all these different study groups, you know, because who doesn't get weight-bearing exercise, right? Now MK7 comes down the pike, and MK7 is really exciting because much lower doses work really well to affect some of the blood numbers we look at. And much lower doses means much less expensive doses. And that got people really excited, myself included. And then we started seeing some of the more meaningful research in the last few years that actually have looked at fracture risk reduction. And MK7 does not perform like the MK4 does. It is doing some things in the bloodstream that are useful, and there is some benefit, but the real solid, proven benefit is still with the MK4. Why don't you want to take MK4? Well, it's expensive. The standard dose is 45 milligrams a day. I've seen a lot of bottles in this country that sell a 5 milligram or 15 milligram. They say take 1 pill a day. In Japan, where it is an approved osteoporosis drug, the standard dose is 45, and that is the dose they test again and again and again and again. And I think in the early 1990s, they actually did a comparative trial. It was like 5, 15, and 45, and the 5 and 15 didn't work, the 45 did. Now, longer term, given decades, the lower doses might very well be valuable, and certainly we see lifetime intake in much lower doses is a predictor of better outcomes here. But again, if you want it to work kind of quickly, you're looking at 45 a day. I'd suggest 45 a day. You know, is it worrisome to take 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 times the daily value? Is this going to throw your clotting off? The short answer is no, almost definitely not. I say that study after study in Japan was 45 milligrams. They actually did one study that was 90, just to see if that astronomical dose created any problems in healthy individuals. It didn't. Now, if you're on Coumadin, or a drug that prevents clotting by interfering with vitamin K activity, then you're going to likely negate partially or fully the effect of that drug by taking a huge amount of vitamin K. Doesn't mean the vitamin K itself is hurting your clotting, but it's lessening the effectiveness of your medication. So that is the real concern we have with the vitamin K. But beyond that, again, just it is my favorite bone density, my favorite osteoporosis nutrient. It's hard for me to shake the habit of talking about bone density, bone density, bone density, because when I am speaking at the health food store, naming a disease, osteoporosis, violates federal law. We're not allowed to mention diseases in the marketing of dietary supplements, and my words are construed as marketing. In this talk, I'm suddenly free to say osteoporosis, and I feel like naked in front of the camera, like I'm doing something wrong. Vitamin K has some side benefits as well. Calcium management. Vitamin K is basically like, on a biochemical level, it's basically like a handle that the body picks up the calcium and moves it around with, puts it into the right places, keeps it out of the wrong ones. And we see some very interesting research, good research, looking at reduction in stroke, reduction in kidney stones, reduction in general heart disease risk. It's a really cool nutrient. And if you're like me and you have a bad habit of coming home late from work and eating grilled cheese more often than you should, and you're worried about excess of calcium intake, maybe one of the better things we can do for that as well. I will just say for myself, osteoporosis is not, I don't feel like it's a personal high risk for me. I'm male. I weigh 200, I'm 6'6", I weigh 230 pounds. I feel my bones are probably in good shape. Vitamin K is one of the half dozen or so supplements I try to take daily because I like all of the benefit it has even outside of osteoporosis. I will finally say that for those who don't want to spend $50 or $60 a month on a clinical dose of the MK4, there are some products that combine low doses of MK4, moderate doses of MK7, MK1. Those combinations are unproven and untested, but they seem like a reasonable way to get some protection without breaking the bank. If you don't have a great sense of urgency, like I need the proven thing right now. I am so sorry it is 7:53. I do not know how to talk quickly. I'm going to shut up and take questions.
Okay, well, you know what? Let me go ahead and add me.
And because I did just see a question in the chat, are we talking micrograms with vitamin D? So we used to talk IUs, international units. There was a federal mandate to now start labeling in micrograms. I can't break the IU habit. It's how I know to measure. Every number I've given has been international units. Okay.
You've mentioned that the vitamin K is for clotting, or that the K stood for clotting, right?
It's in German.
In German.
Yeah.
And so I'm assuming that when you're saying that, and the reason why you don't want to, it loses the effectiveness of Coumadin, because Coumadin is to create more passage in your bloodstream.
And Coumadin works specifically by interfering or blocking vitamin K activity. So other anti-clotting drugs, you should in theory be able to take vitamin K without interfering with that drug's mechanism.
Okay.
I have a question. Can I ask it?
Oh, sure. Go right ahead.
Here's my question. You've talked a lot about bone density, and you've talked somewhat, although less, about bone quality. And I have been reading these are kind of really different and complementary things. Are there any things you recommend, any vitamins or whatever, for bone quality distinct from bone density?
No. And the reason why we talk about bone quality theoretically and bone density concretely is because we can't really measure bone quality in a living. I mean, you can measure bone density, you can't measure bone quality, or you at least can't without cutting into someone's leg and, testing. We can do it in rats because we kill them. We can't do it in people. So bone density is often a measure of bone quality, even if it doesn't always track like 1-to-1 in terms of the ratio, if that makes sense.
Yes, so there's nothing you would recommend that's directed toward bone quality that you haven't recommended.
I mean, I think the MK4 absolutely. You know, strontium, vitamin D, magnesium, and calcium, they all move in that direction. There's nothing that does just one and not the other.
And what's a good dose of strontium?
The standard dose is 680 milligrams a day. Some people will take half of that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.
Yeah.
Also, someone asked, are we talking milligrams or micrograms with K?
Milligrams. The MK4, it's 45 milligrams a day. And yes, you will see that as an astronomical multiple of the daily value.
Great. Okay, and then someone else said that they wanted your recommendation on a type of vitamin for strontium, that they were taking a brand very popular on the internet.
I am not.
I know you won't do that, but necessarily, but they said they were getting stomach issues with it. Is that?
I am not aware of any meaningful differences between brands of strontium. I would try to buy it from a company that it's hard to mess it up. Like, you don't need to buy like the super Rolls Royce of strontiums. It should be fine. If it's giving you a stomach upset, then I don't think I've got a better one.
Okay. All right, and then let's see what else. Oh, I guess that's a pretty interesting question. Does the MK4 help your calcium be absorbed, or is this an actual form of calcium?
No, it is an actual vitamin that
Helps
the body utilize calcium.
Okay, and then I had a question, honestly, previous to this, where magnesium can be a real issue. In fact, I was taking higher doses of it about a year ago, and everything was bothering my stomach. I thought I had stomach issues, and I was taking large doses of it based on another person's advice who is a nutritional consultant for osteoporosis. And when I got off of it completely, I was fine. And I've been a little hesitant to go back onto magnesium just because it was so bad. But having that ratio of 2-to-1 maybe would be more feasible. Do you ever find that's true for people that, like, for example, milk of magnesia was a magnesium product that helped people to get rid of their. So what is your thoughts on that, on the whole issue of whether people could have problems and at what point?
I mean, some people have the problems on purpose. I mean, again, I put problems in air quotes, but just to get personal, when I don't eat my vegetables, I could use some help with regularity. I take magnesium to move in that direction. We sell a lot of magnesium to people for that purpose, to be honest. So anytime there are a lot of small molecules in the gut that aren't absorbed, they set up a diffusion gradient, draw water into the gut, give you loose stools. And that's how Miralax works. That's magnesium, that's vitamin C. So how do you prevent there from being a lot of small molecules in the gut? Well, you get them absorbed. And how do you get them absorbed? Well, first of all, you don't overload the body's ability to absorb. You take your dose and divide it into multiple times a day. You also take better absorbing forms. Sometimes you just take less. Sometimes you're just very sensitive. Now, the ratio of calcium to magnesium, I don't think should matter for this, unless we're talking calcium carbonate, which is a constipating form of calcium. So in a sense, the bad calcium constipates, the bad magnesium loosens. So in a perfect world, you wouldn't be taking the bad forms either way. But I think there's a lot of trial and error, and bearing in mind that this isn't you're not risking anything other than a day or two's discomfort. My suggestion is go forth with trial and error.
Mm, that's good. That's good. Good advice. Okay, let's see what else we've got here, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
You know, people are asking about specific vitamin types and supplement mixes. And I know it's probably not copacetic to comment on a specific brand for you, but
I'm
are there-
happy to comment on specific brands, but I sometimes I'm more opinionated than I should be.
okay. Well, there's one in particular called Bone Up. Would you mind commenting on that?
So I used to really like that company. They had this guy called Jara Rogovan who founded the company. He was a mission-driven guy. He was crazy. He was zealous. He, you know, I still recommend that. They had an ownership change about 2 years ago. I still like that product a lot. It is my favorite recommendation for one-size-fits-all calcium-based formula that doesn't break the bank. Now, it doesn't have the high-quality magnesium. A lot of combinations don't. You could probably use a little more vitamin K. You know, the vitamin D may be a little bit on the low end for wintertime. But again, you know, nothing's perfect. It's a nice, solid product. We've been selling it for 20 years. It's good.
Okay. And knowing that you would comment on another product, I'm going to ask you about Algae Cal, which came up earlier.
So Algae Cal means something different in Canada than it does in the US, in terms of how it's branded, how it's marketed. But that, to me, it would be important. I was dealing with a company that did consistent heavy metal testing on that product, because batches can be variable. Having said that, if the company is doing that, you know, I said at the beginning, there are different forms of calcium, the algae-based and the bone-based. The Bone Up is the MCHA. It's the one from cow bones. The Algae Cal is the vegetarian equivalent. I think it's good. It just costs twice as much as the cow bone. And the research that kind of puts it on a pedestal is a little bit questionable. Like the big study, and it wasn't that big, was like Algae Cal plus vitamin D plus magnesium helped. Well, why not just study on its own? But, you know, I still like it.
Okay,
May I ask another question?
sure.
Occasionally I read things and I tend to be persuaded because I read something and I say, that makes sense, I'll go out and buy some. 3 things I've started taking recently, because articles seem to suggest it really works and is helpful, are a gut bacteria biome thing, you know, the 100 billion something or other,
Sure.
whey protein, and also collagen powder. Because I read, you know, collagen and protein are what the matrix is made of in the bone, and the gut thing and something. Anyway, they seemed not dangerous, but I have purchased all 3 of those. What do you think of collagen, whey protein, and gut biome stuff?
Let me not get into that in any sort of depth due to the time constraints we have. What I will say is I like all of them. You know, whey protein has some calcium if you're looking for that. You don't need to eat collagen to make collagen. You need to eat protein to make collagen. I like collagen as a protein source. I haven't seen any research directly connecting any of these to significant bone density benefits.
Okay.
And I would still recommend all 3 of them to people for other reasons.
Okay.
So
Good, thanks.
collagen for protein and protein.
I mean, in my family, we do a smoothie most mornings. My wife, our 5-year-old, and I will drink the same smoothie. We use whey protein, but again, now we're stepping away from bones, and I know y'all want me off, so you can talk amongst yourselves. So,
No, I thought that had to do with bones, those things.
and I think my take on it is, I don't see them having a direct impact on bones.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
As one of our recurring themes in this talk has been, sometimes I come back 5 years later and I realize I was wrong.
Thank you for your honesty. We appreciate that, actually. Let me see if there's a couple more questions I can finish up here.
I just like to say medicine and research is a moving target. So don't don't feel too bad if your opinion changes every 5 years.
I am delighted by the fact that, that I don't know everything.
We should never all know everything. You should always have curiosity to know what's next. So very healthy. I think we answered everything on here. Maybe Claudia, did you feel like your question got answered? I think it did.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Sure.
I read an article. I was taking strontium for a little bit, and then I read an article that stated that strontium actually on a DEXA scan shows improvement because it fills in the voids in the bone, but it actually is not increasing your bone density. And I was wondering if you had an opinion on that.
I do. So it absolutely fills in the spaces in a DEXA scan, and it was a very valid concern to say, we're worried that that's true. We're worried that it's filling the spaces in a DEXA scan, but it is not actually improving the quality or resiliency of bones. But now we've seen research, like we've seen one study that tracked people for 10 years. And the first 5 years, there was a control group, and the next 5 years, it just was like open label because they couldn't keep it funded, like whatever. But we saw that over 10 years, there was a reduction in fracture risk that was maintained. So this is where we had a theory or concern that seems to have honestly been laid to rest. And it wasn't just this study. So I feel confident, and I think the research is confident now, if we look at it in the last few years, that it does help.
Thank you.
Is this strontium that we can actually get here in the States, or is this what is available in Europe?
So the research, every study I've seen has been on a form of strontium called strontium ranolate, which is not available in the States. We have a strontium citrate. One of the things that's controversial about strontium is the strontium citrate going to do what the strontium ranolate does in all the trials? I'd argue yes. Skeptics would remain doubtful. I would argue yes.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a specific brand of any of these that you favor?
No. As far as I'm aware, all strontium is the same. As far as I'm aware, so the vitamin K2s, they're different forms, but as far as I'm aware, all the MK4 is made by the same global raw material supplier. Again, it's just find a company that isn't going to screw it up. This is not like, different kinds of echinacea that'll have these subtle differences. It should be the same. Vitamin D, I like vitamin D3. I police supplement quality, and one of the reasons I'm so concerned about the algae-derived calciums is because we were, as a store, at the center of what eventually led to I think it was like a $7 million settlement against one of these companies that wasn't doing their testing right. I take this stuff really seriously. I just think we're talking about some nutrients right now that there aren't going to be differences between brands. Yeah.
That's really great. That's great. Nice to hear all that. And I'm amazed how much knowledge you have poured into us tonight. It's fabulous. I'm sure you have a lot more you could share too, if we'd given you more time. So
I'm happy to give you all the time. I'm going to just engage in one small piece of self-promotion, which is to put our store's website in the chat. You can sign up for our newsletter. We obviously sell and talk about vitamins. We have a lot of staff that really knows what the heck they're talking about. But we also just have food and beautiful soups, and just we're like what Whole Foods should be. So swing on by, sign up for our newsletter. If I'll also put my email in the chat. I am super overloaded. So what I will say is, if you want to ask me a question that requires a 5-paragraph reply, you're not going to get it from me. That's just where things are right now. We're really short on staff due to COVID, but I'm happy to communicate in a way that doesn't make my fingers bleed. Or if you're willing to wait 2 weeks, I'll make my fingers bleed. But it has been a genuine pleasure to be invited to this. And, thank you for letting me into your living rooms.
Oh, it was a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a great discussion. And one of our participants asked if you have any kind of an outline of the way you presented tonight.
No, but I really should. At some point I should write it up. So how about this? Here's my commitment to you and to everyone else. We will have something on our newsletter within 3 months. So that's an incentive to sign up. We don't spam you. Just enjoy the articles, and yeah.
Sounds great.
And Adam, aren't you doing the expanded talk in a couple weeks
Oh yeah, next week.
at the school?
Oh,
Yep.
good to know.
Yeah, it's mostly going to be the same information, just probably said a little bit more slowly. And with more props.
Well, thank you for fitting us in, and also for being flexible about where you were viewed from. And I appreciate the time you spent tonight. And so does everybody else.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Adam.
Yes. Thank you, Adam. Thank you.
Have a good night.
Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you. It's wonderful. Okay, well, hello there. Let me unpin myself, and let me say thank you for listening tonight to our YouTube audience.